Now for a classic encounter between David Bronstein and Paul Keres from the Candidates Tournament in 1950, a game which I think is really one of the calling cards of Bronstein. Very aggressive, interesting opening play, a gambit variation, and long-term positional compensation, which turned out to be too much for one of the best defenders of the Ruy Lopez to deal with. So Bronstein selects the Ruy Lopez, and Keres, as so often, picks a classical closed defense. And in this position, of course, Keres has used the Marshall move order. So after c3, d5, we'd enter Marshall territory. Bronstein used d4, which is a viable weapon even today against this line, and Keres played d6. The modern alternative is to play knight takes d4 when white has a choice between taking on d4 and playing c3. Clearly queen takes d4, c5 followed by c4 isn't advisable, but this variation with c3, or the slightly surprising bishop takes f7 check. Rook takes f7, knight takes e5. After this, rook drops back, queen takes d4. So very interesting, complicated play in both of those variations. But after d4, d6, c3, we reach a position which is also commonly reached after the 7 d6 move order. The c3 castles, d4. And clearly this affects what white wants to do in the Ruy Lopez, which is to play c3 and d4. The problem is the omission of h3 allows black to play bishop g4. And this position is still very interesting. White has two principled approaches, d5, closing the center temporarily, or bishop e3. They're both interesting variations. After d5, this is knight a5, bishop c2, c6, h3, and bishop c8, in order to avoid bishop d7. Knight takes e5 and d6, which is good for white. But bishop c8 takes, and queen c7 followed by queen takes c6 is fully reasonable. We get a kind of Najdorf type pawn structure where white's going to try to exploit this hole on d5. Actually also quite interesting in this position after h3 is to take on f3 and take on d5 when black is quite solid. But that's the d5 variation. Bishop e3, knight takes e4 runs into bishop d5, which is actually still playable as a temporary piece sacrifice, but is quite complicated. Black tends to avoid that and go, for instance, for clarifying the position in the center, followed by, say, knight a5, bishop c2, knight c4, bishop c1, c5, b3, knight b6. There are a number of options here. But in this game, Bronstein selects a very interesting move, which has fallen really out of fashion, it seems, although I don't understand why, because Bronstein won this game in great style and expressed the view in his book that it's a fully playable sacrifice, which certainly the game seems to demonstrate. So black took on f3 and took on d4. Clearly he has to do this in order to not just be worse. But now after queen d1, d takes e3, knight takes e3, we see the point of white's idea. He has two bishops and potentially mobile pawns in the center, in exchange for which black has an extra pawn, which is nice. But the position does seem to be dynamically balanced. At least it's not obvious to me why white should be any worse here. And the game continued quite consistently. Knight a5, bishop c2, rook e8, f4, Now, Keres played b4, trying to exchange a pair of knights, and c6, driving the queen away, queen d3 and g6 to try to put some defense on this diagonal. But the problem is that now he has some slightly weak dark squares around his king, which Bronstein exploits very effectively. King h1, bishop f8, rook f1, bishop g7. And now it's interesting in this game just how slowly and in what a controlled fashion Bronstein plays. So his plan is perhaps simply to bring the rook over to e1, after which he can play e5 or f5 and start attacking the black king. Instead, Keres went c5, bishop a4 drove the rook back, and now rook b1, simply protecting his pawn. And after queen b6, f5, bishop d4, Bronstein managed to bring his queen over to the king side to start attacking there. In terms of improvements here for black, bishop d4 doesn't look great to me, but it's difficult to suggest what else black could do. In general terms, I'd be very keen to get this knight back into the game to e5 or d4, so something like rook d8 to defend the d6 pawn looks sensible to me. Bishop d4 leaves the black king a little bit bare. And here, after bishop h6, bishop g7 takes, Bronstein comments that Keres had underestimated this move, queen g5, which is just devastating because this rook is coming to f4. And actually after b3, as Bronstein notes, he could directly have played this move, followed by a direct attack on the black king, but instead he just dealt with all potential counterplay. And now queen h6, which is a mating continuation. Clearly in this variation, black gets mated. So a classic, but one which maybe hasn't lost all of its currency, because this is a very topical opening variation. The position after bishop g4 can arise in the Ruy Lopez either via the classical d6 move order or the Marshall move order. And this particular gambit line, to my eyes, just looks very enterprising for white indeed.